Welcome to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. And now here's your host, Wade T. Lightheart.
What is awesome health? It's actually an acronym that stands for air, water, exercise, sunshine, optimizers, mental beliefs and attitudes, and education. These are the pillars of peak health, and my team and I have created a free 12-week course that you can use to transform. Each day, you'll get a written and video lesson delivered to your inbox. Everything is covered from the foundations of digestion to advanced alternative therapies few people know about. And again, it's 100% free. Just go to bioptimizers.com. That's bioptimizers.com.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's Wade T. Lightheart from Bioptimizers with another edition of the Awesome Health Podcast. And today we're going to talk about a topic that I love. It's called neurofeedback. And particularly, we're going to get into a couple things like EEG brain mapping and why neurofeedback is gaining popularity and maybe why it would have been not within the toolbox of a lot of psychologists or people in the psychological field, and how it can be used for a lot of things, including improving, complicated conditions, as well as accelerating into excellence. There's a wide range of things that neurofeedback can do. And today's guest, Dr. Andrew Hill, who is a cognitive neuroscience from UCLA, is the founder of the Peak Brain Institute and a leading neurofeedback practitioner and biohacking coach for clients worldwide. And he's got some unique integrations around that. At the Peak Brain Institute, Dr. Hill provides individualized training programs to help you optimize your brain across goals of stress, sleep, attention, brain fog, creativity, and athletic performance. And he joins us today. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Oh, thanks for having me, Wade. Nice to be here.
So I guess, it's so interesting. We were chatting a little bit beforehand, and my girlfriend has just finished her master's at a top university, and she's moving into a PhD in neurofeedback. And a couple comments that she has mentioned, she went for certifications and she goes around, there's like a few old people in the neurofeedback program that have been around since the 70s, like its early eras. But when you go to the traditional or the real well-respected universities out there, there's not a lot of conversation around neurofeedback and all the benefits it provides. So as someone who's been in the industry as long as you, I'd like to kind of find out how you got into it, why you got into it, and how it differs from maybe the psychological world that is common in the educational institutions today.
Sure. So there's a lot there. Thanks for setting that up. The field of neurofeedback is not that old. I mean, even EEG is not that old. We're in 2024 right now, and EEG, the first human EEG, was recorded in the summer of 1924. 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. This year, EEG was the first human, and the guy that recorded it didn't believe what he was looking at, so it spent like 5 more years before he published, and no one believed him. And that was 95 years ago. And neurofeedback, as we use it now, this way of manipulating brainwaves, was discovered in the mid-60s.
Can you explain to our listener who might not be familiar what an EEG is? And
sure.
That was like, oh, well, is this really happening?
Yeah, so we still don't really know deeply what it is. A lot of brain stuff is this way, where we're in a phenomenological space, we're describing stuff, and we're sort of saying, oh, well, it acts this way, it has these properties, but we're less good at saying, oh, and then it means all these other related phenomena. So we're still, especially for brain stuff, a lot of it's invisible. I mean, a lot of psychological stuff, it's silent. You can't see it. You can't see your pain. You can't see concussions the same way you can see a broken arm. And the brain is also made up of things that you're aware of and things you're not. Most of the brain you're not really aware of. And a lot of the brain that you do the awareness stuff with, both the thinky cognitive stuff as well as all the perceptual and emotional and memory, a lot of that is driven by the bark or the surface of the brain called the cortex, which is this big sheet of tissue that's wrinkled up to cram into the skull. And the cortex, if you flatten it out, has these columns of tissue running through it. And there's 6 layers. And they're very conserved, this architecture all throughout the cortex. The proportion of each layer changes as you move throughout the brain, but it has these 6 layers. And within that column, you can think of this like a city skyscraper of an apartment building or something. And it's got a lot of communication, about 30,000 neurons hanging out in this little block, and 100,000 glial cells or support cells in this little block. And it's dancing in a rhythm. There's a block party going on, and it's doing one thing, one giant rhythm emerging out of these thousands and thousands of cells. Now they're doing stuff within, but they've agreed this is our song for Friday night, and they're just rocking out that corner of the block. And you've got billions of these things called micro columns, or often called mini columns. It's confusing, but one is electricity, one is size, microvolts, and I think mini nanometers or something. I don't know. I forget what the size unit is, but these are the computational units. These are the CPUs of the cortex. Most of the brain, the surface of the brain, is these things, and they send out distant connections to far neighborhoods and local connections to close neighborhoods, and are influenced and influencing and passing information back, like New York City in the 50s with clotheslines and people calling out the windows and all kinds of, neighborhood vibe happening. And that's the local rhythm, the local EEG, the electrical encephalogram, the rhythm of electricity, the stable pattern of dancing, a pattern of firing of these neurons. And EEG, or brainwaves, go from around close to, 0 times per second all the way up to thousands of times per second, called hertz. And we think classically of EEG from about like 1 to 40 hertz, although it does exist outside that range. And in the low end of that, about below 2 hertz, you've got delta. And delta is the heartbeat of the brain. It keeps things like your heart and lungs moving, and your deep sleep happening, and memory consolidation during deep sleep. Your immune system, your cell metabolism has a lot of delta phenomena. Delta creates a literal mechanical wave twice per second washing through the brain like an agitation cycle at night, to strip out all the toxins from metabolic byproduct. It's really powerful, deep life stuff, but you don't think in it, you live in it. If you're feeling it when you're awake, you're feeling deeply tired and foggy because your brain is trying to rest when you're actually awake. Next one up is theta. Theta is lubrication. One of those little modules, those microcolumns will combine to create information machinery and sensory machinery, and some of it's fixed and some of it's variable, but it'll come together to create a mix of brainwave to tune its own behavior. And theta is a release, takes the brakes off, lets things happen. So you can have lots of theta for a very brief moment, 6.5 hertz theta. Theta is 4 to 7, 4 to 8 hertz. But the top edge of that, 6.5, is insight, a release of, aha, that thing I remembered. That's 6.5 roughly, the memory access moment. It's almost involuntary, stuff bubbles. And around 4 to 7 broadly, you've got a disinhibition. So if it's everywhere in the cortex, then your brain is squirrel and you can't sit still and you're distractible. And we call that ADHD, disinhibited cortical sort of states. If you've got it maybe over the front midline of the brain, whose job it is to select what the internal environment is focusing on, called the anterior cingulate, the CEO, do this, think of this, do this, think of this. If the anterior cingulate's making theta, it latches onto some random stimuli and starts to get stuck. So we start biting our nails or having songs play in our head all day long. But if the gas pedal waves, the ones we actually use voluntarily, like beta waves, the up in the teens, if those get stuck in the front midline, now we have an intrusive thought pattern, and we call that OCD, perseveration, stuck thoughts. So you can start to see what I'm doing. I'm looking at different architecture of the brain, these big gross hubs of information processing, decision making. We have at least 3 major networks: the default mode network, executive network, the salience network. And these come together and make big structures for creating our experience of the mind. And then we have the motor system and the sleep system and the sensory system all plumbed in. And you end up with this picture of all the map of the modules essentially making brainwaves. And you can look at your brainwaves. An EEG is a measurement of brainwaves. We do something called QEEG, EEG, or quantitative. It just means we're measuring it compared to something, doing analysis on it. Usually what you mean is you're doing an age-matched sample comparison. So your brain at rest, cap on the head, squirt it full of gel, sit still for 10 minutes, eyes closed, and 10 minutes, eyes open. Record what your brain is doing and compare that to a database of thousands of people who are your age and plot you on a bell curve and look at amounts of brainwaves, distribution of brainwaves, connectivity patterns, speed patterns of all these different brainwaves compared to the average person your age, and look at how weird you are. Where's all the stuff that sticks out? Where are the biomarkers? Where are the phenotype patterns that are unique to you? Now, where QEEG is a problem, and one of the reasons it hasn't taken off broadly, is because people are weird. Good job, be weird. You cannot diagnose off of a QEEG. Nothing really rises quite to diagnostic validity. These are stable patterns for you, but what is a problem for you might be a strength for somebody else, or not a problem for somebody else. So you want to look at the outliers. We also do executive function testing alongside it, go, no go style attention testing. And that gives you some really valid boundaries on your guesses for some of the broader features. And then I walk through a brain map, a QEEG with someone and say, look, here's 6 things, 8 things, 15 things about your brain that are unusual. Your alpha waves are doing this. It's true. Your theta waves doing that. That's also true. That's kind of cool. Hey, sometimes it means this. Often it means that. What do you think? This part of the brain, these brain waves, this phenomena does that. And the person usually says, oh my gosh, that's me. And I care about that. Oh, okay. Well, then great. We're now in the ballpark, at least. And now you have not necessarily diagnostic precision, but you have as a perspective of the system and how it works. And you have agency. Now you can take those phenomena. If you've got some front midline beta and it's creating intrusive thoughts, OCD type phenomena, well, stretch it out. Stick a wire there, put some ear clips on, and measure the beta waves moment to moment as the brain makes them, that sort of tight tone of that resource. And also measure the alpha waves, the medium frequency, the neutral, the between the gears tone. As you make both these brain waves, they're going to change a little bit on their own. Whenever the alpha happens to go up, the beta happens to relax at the same time. Computer sees that and starts to applaud the brain. A little auditory and visual massage. Hey, good job, brain. Good job, brain. Brain's like, stuff. Hey, stuff's cool. I like stuff. And it watches. And then the alpha collapses a bit again. The beta comes back up like it often does. And the game slows down or stops. And the brain says, I don't like no stuff. Where's my stuff? And a couple of seconds later, the alpha comes back up on its own and the game reacts. And the brain goes, oh, alpha's moved. Oh, and the brain notices this. The mind does not. I am distinguishing those things. You can't feel your brainwaves. So it's mostly involuntary operant conditioning. The big trick is we move the goalposts and keep the computer next to the person. So we're only applauding change in the proper direction for that workout. And after about 2 or 3 20, 30-minute workouts, over a week or two, you start to feel it. After the 3rd session, 4th session, usually your brain goes, oh, alpha. Gives you a giant surge of alpha for a few hours in that tissue. And you're like, wow, I don't feel stressy and obsessy right now. That's really weird. Huh? And then the next day you're like, no, I was imagining it. I might have felt, no, I was imagining it. And then you do another session of neurofeedback and it happens again. And you're like, well, wait a minute, guys. This front midline protocol, I think it's, okay, great. Make a note. And you learn to index working your brain out the same way you might figure out in the gym that you need more of an incline press for the old shoulder thing you have versus a, narrow grip because you got some weak, sternum stuff going on. You learn to tailor the workout to the person based on how it feels. And you iterate towards their goals and then go back and map the brain again and measure the executive function again. So we do that every 20 or 25 sessions at peak brain. So about every other month, you're remapping, reassessing. And if you didn't do neurofeedback or any other big interventions or have big events happen, you're the same. Brain mapping, EEG is the same month after month after month after month. And so is executive function largely. So when you add something like neurofeedback, you progressively push the brain around and you get these changes. You typically get about a standard deviation or a Z-score on a bell curve every other month, every 20, 25 sessions in things like executive function performance and executive function markers in the brain or anxiety features in the brain. And you're really validating it not based on what you're doing on the assessments, but based on this day-to-day How is this resource feeling? How is your brain acting for you? Again, to the backdrop of all the analysis and testing and perspective and tracking other features. So you're really flipping this like treatment idea a little bit on its head instead of becoming this therapeutic container where, thrusting agency back upon people by teaching them how their brain works and then helping them move through making small changes or big changes sometimes. So,
right. So if I heard what you said in a nutshell, you're basically saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to strap on essentially a silicon-based extension to your carbon brain that provides a feedback of data points that you aren't aware of necessarily. You have maybe you don't have a revision, like a cognitive way of monitoring this, but that the new extension in the QEEG is saying, here's what's going on in your brain. And you're like, oh, and then you have an integrative unit that starts reframing or changing that through how reward-based systems and neural networks, like creating tones or sounds or things that the cells go, oh, I want to create that neural connection and do that. And then the concordance with your physiology means that you're getting this change in what the physiology is producing as a byproduct, which are these waves, and from you can measure. And then there's a subjective experience of, oh, I feel different than I used to before. And at the early stages, you might not notice it simply because you couldn't notice it in the first place, but then these subjective confirmations start to emerge. All of a sudden, I was stuck as an executive with these complex problems, and then suddenly I have insight, or I used to feel stress under this circumstance, family relationship, or a work situation. Now that I don't have that experience anymore. And so you're like, oh, this stuff is really working. Now, and then of course you're taking snapshots essentially through time to document and illustrate how your brain is actually shifting by its brainwave products.
So we're doing the objective mapping and reassessing and modeling of what's going on every other month. And the subjective report day to day, how's your sleep? How's your stress? How's your seizure? How's your mother-in-law making you mad? And as things start to fluctuate day to day, they start to shift. You're like, whoa, that was weird. My mother-in-law didn't make me mad. I was super chill after that. That was weird. Hey guys, I'm actually less mad right now. Okay, try that protocol again. It's very much like your personal trainer, staying on top of what's happening, what your goals are, and trying to do goal congruent support, not fixing you, not about, oh, he's got a diagnosis, we must fix him. More like, okay, goals around this, success looks like this, let's iterate, let's Marco Polo our way towards that sucker and figure out where the phenomena are the person cares about. How they describe that is actually pretty important too. So you can describe some experience you're having, the stuff you can work on gets pretty interesting. You can do a lot of reliable work on things like creativity access or flow state. You have a tough time talking about your emotions with your partner, easy. You can't move into a generative place of ideas and, creativity. That's really, that moment when you fall asleep and you solve world hunger or have the best story idea or whatever, that moment of access, you can reliably train yourself to put a doorknob onto that mode and step into it for nonlinear sort of harvest and move back into linear mode to go, do your taxes. So what you can do to your brain is pretty wild once you leave this perspective of, oh, I got to fix myself. Here's our thing. And the brain mapping starts that even before you do any interventions. If I show you how your brain works and say, look, this thing is front midline you had, kind of obsessive, but it's also kind of a CEO brain, steel trap mind that gets stuck sometimes. It suddenly is this thing you can understand, a little bit externalize, and it's not just a thing happening to you. And I think that for suffering, especially for complaints and other stuff that's in the way, just understanding it doesn't change the suffering, but it makes it a lot harder to be overwhelmed, ashamed, guilty, frustrated. And it starts that process of agency and thinking about transformation and what can I do and how can I measure and what's going on. And I think that is actually the most important part of neurofeedback, is the fact that it gets people into that perspective of, hey, it's your brain. What would you like to do with it? And maybe let's figure out how it works. So it's my little soapbox there. Sorry.
I love it. Well, I'm a super fan of brain training. And I can Matt and I speak about this often when we are at biohacking conferences or in executive teams or just at business conferences or personal, connections. We all come back to, you don't know how good brain training can be until you've done it. And once you've done it, you just don't want to stop it because it's transformative. It transforms your capacity. It reshapes what you can do, what you think you could do with what you can do. And it gives you access to a way of shifting our internal representation of ourselves, and what the opportunities and limitations might have been in the past begin to evolve and change. And that gives a real zest to life. I want to touch on something you sort of danced in there, but didn't really get to. And it goes back to my earlier part of the question, which is, this is transformative technology for people, particularly around psychology. Most of the psychological literature and directions is based on you're broken and we need counseling and we need a pharmaceutical intervention inside of this.
Yeah.
And I'm not here to disparage that. I'm just like, okay, that's what's common. But it's more common than going in a route where you can just bypass all that stuff and go right into the shifting of the physiology itself. And a lot of those things go away without the need for, hey, how was your childhood and who was abusive to you and who wasn't and how did you frame that and blah, 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 blah. Not that that's not valuable and can be very helpful in conjunction. But why is this not so proliferated in the world today relative to these other interventions?
Yeah, I've got about 6 different answers for that. And I think they're all valid, and they range from sounding really reasonable and it makes sense to a little crazy and conspiracy focused.
I love it.
They're all right. They're all true. I'm just going to say that they're all right. The first thing is, let me ask a question. Why don't we all have amazing cardiovascular health and abs? Kind of know how. As a culture, as a society, we kind of know how to develop that like really strong, cardiovascular fitness that is the number one killer. And we kind of don't, because it takes work and practice and effort and a bit of guidance. And so it's not super easy to change your brain. It's faster than medication or almost anything else, but it still takes a few months and it takes expensive tech. I mean, when I got involved in the field 20 something years ago, you needed 2 computers because one wasn't enough. And they had to talk over a parallel cable. One ran the game, one ran the signal processing on the EEG. And, the system cost 20 grand. And that's a lot for a psychologist, 25 years ago. Even now, it's a couple grand for the hardware and software, but the hard part's using it. It's kind of like anyone can buy a kettlebell, resistance bands, or a Nautilus machine, but a good coach can get you results with whichever tool set, based on what you do with it. And so with neurofeedback, there's been a bit of a tool, dearth. It's been a niche field, and the tools are hard and expensive and a little buggy. And that part of it's mostly gone away in the past, 60 years. Now, again, neurofeedback was discovered in the mid-60s. The guy that discovered this flavor, the flavor that's used mostly in the world, he died this year as an emeritus faculty, still doing occasional, guest stuff.
What was that fellow's name?
Barry Sturman, Dr. Barry Sturman in the 60s discovered neurofeedback on cats. Cats are really bad instruction followers. That's sort of instantly demonstrated from the very first experiment. It was one of these like mistaken by, happenstance experiments. Discovered that it reduced seizures dramatically. So this actually feeds into the question about why it's not everywhere. So in 1960s, mid-60s, Sturman was experimenting on cats. He's a learning scientist doing basic learning experiments. And NASA had some grant money on the floor and said, look, we need you to test how dangerous methylhydrazine, rocket fuel, is. People are reporting in the Apollo program, reporting nausea and hallucinations. Like, this is how dangerous. So doing a safety test, an LD50 test, which is basically, we used to do a lot more destructive animal research, and we wouldn't do this today, but it's essentially figuring out how dangerous chemicals are by poisoning animals. So Sturman created plexiglass cages that were airtight, put a beaker of rocket fuel in it and a cat in the cage, closed the door, started a timer, and tracked symptoms. And he did 32 cats like this. And of them, 24 of the cats had a perfect dose-dependent curve with regards to time. Increased time meant increased symptoms. And 5 minutes in, they're drooling, and 10 minutes in, they're stumbling, and 15 minutes in, they're making noise, and 40 minutes in, they're all having seizures. Every single one of these 24 cats are having seizures, and there was, other worse symptoms, coma and death as part of it for these cats. But 8 of the cats didn't have these instability events, and they were like 2.5 hours in before they started to show any instability events. Sturman's like, wait a minute, have I discovered super cats? Is there a special cat gene? What's going on here?
Mm-hmm.
And turns out, no. He had used these other cats in a previous experiment 6 months before, to see if he could condition brainwaves. So he stuck a eyedropper in their cheek and taped it in and squirted some chicken broth in. Whenever they made a certain brainwave in larger amounts, the cats already make tons of. If you've seen a cat in a windowsill, liquid body and laser-like focus, that combination of motorically inhibited and attentionally activated, that's called sensory motor tone. It's a way of sitting very, very still and being very, very focused. And humans make this thing, most mammals, sensory motor rhythm, SMR. It's made on the strip of tissue that runs ear to ear, the sensory motor strip. And it's kind of like a low beta wave that acts like an alpha. It's a quiescent sort of stilling frequency. Well, it turns out it makes brain seizure resistant. It's the thing we use to pump the brakes on destabilizing into seizure. Sturman's lab manager was epileptic and uncontrolled on many medications, having tens of seizures a week. So they made her an auditory feedback device, an SMR, trained her brain over a few months, and she went off all meds and became seizure-free for a year.
Amazing. That's wild.
So, this was the start of the field, and
Right.
Sturman did this in 1967 or something. And he published an early draft of this seizure impact on the cats to the journal Epilepsia. And the moment his draft hit, his grant funding was pulled by NIH. Back then it was called something else, but it was, he's oddly, for no reason, his grant funding was pulled.
I do know, just as a sidebar, I've interviewed a few neurofeedback experts that have been around for a while. One of them runs a clinic in Sedona, Dr. Hart, and he had his first experiment, I think, was in Joe Camino's lab, and I think Stanford or something.
Alpha, yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
And he had an alpha wave, and he was like, "Oh my God!" He had this aha moment, and he was like, "That was it." But he also said that there was a period where it seemed that there was a government influence that this shut down this entire field. That
I don't know if it's government as much as insurance companies, because that was the big thing happening in drug companies. I think it was insurance companies and drug companies, because Sturman's money was pulled for some reason that was never clear. And he was doing some epilepsy research and it was pulled. And this, Sturman did a metadata study toward the end of his career. I think it was in 2012, he published a study looking at all the seizure literature since the field of neurofeedback had started, and found that across studies, the average reduction is 50%, and 5% of people get complete control of seizures. And I'll tell you, I've never seen a reduction anywhere as poor as 50%. It's always dramatic reduction, almost always dramatic reduction in seizure. So that caught someone's attention. There was some blowback, I think. But, the real big thing, and I'm sure what Dr. Hart was talking about, is child in ADD meetings that were there in the 70s and 80s, really popular. 2 full-time doctors were paid to go to CHAD meetings, 2 salaries around, for many years, just to say neurofeedback didn't work. Because neurofeedback eliminates executive function difficulties in almost everyone. So it was a drug company, threat, essentially. And I think that's what happened with the epilepsy preprint as well. So there's a little bit of, that's the conspiracy side. To pull back a tiny bit, there are some legit reasons why it's not considered the same as medication. Now, I did my grad work at UCLA. A lot of what I did was looking at the mechanisms of neurofeedback, how the brain knows it's happening. How do we know it's happening? How is it happening? Because that was not a well-understood phenomenon. 20 years ago, when I was in the field, you had 3 or 4 big voices yelling at each other on news groups and Usenets and before the massive current internet, and really arguing with massive vitriol about their way being the best way, and this is the only way to do it. And yet, all of these schools of thought were getting amazing results, better than medication approaches usually, but they weren't reconcilable schools of thought about how this stuff works. They're really in conflict. And so I saw this as a blind men and elephant situation.
Yep.
describing phenomena, not really understanding them. And that was, around 2000 or something. So I ended up going back to grad school to really start to answer the question, well, what's happening? Is there a way that we can do it right or do it better? How do we know what's happening? What's happening? And so a lot of what I did was a placebo-controlled double-blind study of neurofeedback where I compared sites and frequencies across people. And I did one of the very first placebo-controlled double-blind studies of neurofeedback ever. I may have been
Wow.
the first one. I mean, I think I did the second one. I found another paper. Someone else, I think, may have done some research around the same time as I published first. But, the reason is it's really hard to blind EEG. You pull a wire off the head or cough or move, and the screen goes crazy.
Yep.
So it's hard to derive contingent variables, contingent measurements off of that real stream information and not know there's fake stuff going on or,
Right.
and then the person who's sitting there, if they move, the game stops briefly. So they know it's live. So I worked with one of the biggest software vendors in the field to develop a placebo-controlled study module where you take samples of EEGs similar to the person, but not theirs. You randomize them, you scale them, you stitch them together, you blend them with the person's EEG to derive all of the visual. So you can look at EEG and see them cough and blink and clench their jaw. But all the training variables, the amount of alpha moment to moment, et cetera, have no contingency. They're derived off of completely non-contingent random information off of disk, essentially. And then I did that looking at sides of the brain and different frequencies versus sham. And you can look at the brain reacting when you do real neurofeedback in the frequency range that you're rewarding and not reacting when you're rewarding random nonsense that's not contingent.
So essentially what you're creating here is an extra feedback loop. So we strapped on the silicon brain to give feedback on the carbon brain. And then the data points you are using back to your carbon brain to sift out the noise in the system through pattern recognition.
That's what I did to understand how it works. Yeah.
But so you're once again, you're using that. And then from that point and exposure to more and more data, the pattern recognition capability of the carbon brain is now saying, oh, we know that's a sneeze, that's a cough, that's a movement, that's irrelevant data. We can take this generalized thing that is not as high resolution as we'd like because of these nuances, but we can get a general point of direction and then from there create programs that we're getting, developmental progress in that. Yeah, we can't eliminate all the friction points on it, but we can say, hey, all of a sudden you don't have OCD brain. We've brought it down.
Yeah, and in terms of making clinical impact, that's exactly how you do it. You
What is Awesome Health? It's actually an acronym that stands for air, water, exercise, sunshine, optimizers, mental beliefs and attitudes, and education. These are the pillars of peak health, and my team and I have created a free 12-week course that you can use to transform. Each day, you'll get a written and video lesson delivered to your inbox. Everything is covered from the foundations of digestion to advanced alternative therapies few people know about. And again, it's 100% free. Just go to bioptimizers.com. That's bioptimizers.com.
And it's not really a thing you've touched on a couple times, but I want to just say out loud and kind of frame it is that we're not actually doing anything special with regards to learning. Yes, there's this extra silicon loop you strapped on of measurement and then feedback, but then the natural learning takes over. This is just using natural associative learning. This is no different than a little baby flopping around and suddenly doing a baby push-up and going, whoa, I can see 14 feet. All of this information is cool. And then 8 minutes later, when you want more information, you reach for it. And the brain remembers left bicep, right bicep extension. The mind doesn't. The brain remembers the unique conformation of neurons firing that produce the information you wanted. That's what neurofeedback is, but we only provide the information for associations that are made in a certain direction. So it's a bit of an involuntary shaping. And then the mind later on that day or the next day gets to go, hey, wait, let me reflect on that and tell you if I like it. And if you do, great, do more of it. If you don't, it wears off initially anyways. It's transient. It's an exercise. So you get this opportunity to go, is this protocol, is this stretch of my brain, is this area related to my goal? Let's see. put your thumb on it, move the brain up and down a little bit. How'd that feel? And it really takes you out of a discrete, I have the answer medical perspective into an exploratory, iterative, experiential perspective. So just to go back to my other non-crazy ideas about why this stuff is, it's hard to do and complicated. It's been a little expensive, although the prices are coming down, and now you can do neurofeedback for a few grand, instead of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars. The research stuff, it's been complicated to do research until very, very recently. There's been pushback, and it's always remained fringy. And then here's the biggest problem of all. You do different things for every person.
Right.
How do you test something that's individualized this much? I'm not sure people have ever done a really good study on placebo-controlled personal training of the body. You would do different things for every person based on their goals and how they progress and how they iterate. It's really hard to do studies you don't do studies like that. And human studies are so expensive that you would need to basically spend a minimum of $5 million to do a really gold standard NIH study these days. Nobody owns neurofeedback. So there's all these pressures against getting it in the mainstreams, all these pressures, for keeping it out, and they're all conspired a little bit. So, it's remained in the control, the bailiwick of skilled individuals, gurus, people who have the magic knowledge. And that's what I'm trying to get us out of. I'm trying to get the agency piece and teach you to read your own brain map, not give you a diagnosis, but teach you to read the data and teach you to do some neurofeedback towards whatever goals you want. And that's the only real big difference that my company has compared to the field. But there's something like 15,000 people in the world that do neurofeedback professionally. Now, there's only 15,000 people in the world, but you probably have 10,000 in North America, especially US and Canada. So most cities you can find somebody doing it, but they're going to be doing it to you. They're a therapist, they're assessing you, they're making decisions, they're coming up with a diagnosis, and they're helping you move to a therapeutic course with a container and some transference and all of that stuff, which is amazing when you need all of that stuff. But I think that there's this other place, this gap between a doctor and a gym where you might want to look at your resources. The biohackers do a blood test and go, oh crap, triglycerides, back off in the Ben & Jerry's, more keto. You learn the data points, you take control, you have agency. If I showed you your alpha speed and your alpha speed is sliding down and running slower than you want, and I could say, oh, word finding issues, delayed recall, tip of the tongue, oh my gosh, yes. Okay. It's your speed of processing, concentration practices for meditation, cholinergic nootropics, racetrams, neurofeedback, meditation of concentration versus insight, sleep hacking with circadian support. You start getting all of these ideas just by knowing how the system works. So I can't stop that soapbox, but
it's so exciting when you get involved in it. And I to that point, I can share with people in my own experience and why I'm a big advocate of neurofeedback. I do a lot of speaking for a living. Essentially, I sell and promote things and interview people and present information in attractive ways through a variety of communication channels. It's part of the business of marketing. And wordsmithing, in combination with emotion and syntax, how you say something, how you hold space, and how you articulate your words, is a very big component to success in that endeavor. And that's why certain people we are attracted to as public speakers or as presenters, because they have an eloquence about them. And yet, even the most eloquent of our presenters in the world, they start to experience a decline over time, brain degenerative conditions associated with the process of aging, and some of these key attributes. And anytime anyone has competency, and this is what I call the athlete's advantage. Athletes discover the downside of aging earlier than the general population because their field essentially peaks before most people are really getting into what's good. A professional athlete, for example, peaks in their 20s to early 30s at the best, and they're usually finished by 35. If that's a great career, and anything beyond that is an anomaly. it's just, in speaking or business, that maybe that peak is in your mid 40s to mid 50s. And then there's a precipitous drop off if you're talking executive function. And then when we're talking about maybe the maximization of life, maybe someone at 55 has got their family worked out and their finances worked out and their things worked out, but now they're on a physical decline or mental decline. And, by 65, they're in some sort of compromised state. And for all of those people, neurofeedback provides a way of optimizing and reducing, number one, I would say, increasing the height and extending the breadth of that optimal performance zone, and which enhances both your experience of life and your contribution to life. And for my own self, I have found that now when I speak, as opposed to, say, 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, whenever I started brain training, it might be a little bit longer than that. It appears in my own representation of life that I have more time to think about the words and articulate those words than I had back then, which I should be worse than then, and now I'm better.
Yeah.
So even though I'm significantly older than that time, my capacity has actually improved. Now, had I started brain training as a teenager or as a young adult, who knows what the absolute top of the curve might have been. But even now, as a guy in his 50s, I'm noticing significant benefits every time I do this. And I go through intensive 5-day, 6-day periods where I really push it hard, multiple sessions a day. Some people tend to go over like a series of weeks. There's no right way to go about it. But the transformational capacity of this makes me so motivated to share this with so many people in the world, as it does with you. What are the things that people are coming into the Peak Brain Institute to address that they come in, you do a brain, maybe like, oh, here it is. You know what? Do this. This is easy stuff because you've got so much experience around it.
Yeah, I would say about 2/3 to 3/4 of the stuff that we work on is in that, oh yeah, one of these brains, great, straightforward. And there's several different types of people within that, within those buckets. But there's a bunch of stuff in the brain that you can think about as regulatory. It's not really a fixed resource. It's kind of meant to change. And there's other stuff in the brain that's considered quote unquote primary, where its job is to sort of do one thing or lock down a little bit. Like language production is hard to do differently after age 7, or visual fusion is impossible nearly to do differently after age 6 months. You can't do visual fusion if you have a strabismus corrected or lazy eye after age 6 months. You see double for most of your life, probably, because you can't learn to do visual fusion again. It's just locked down early in life. Has critical periods, it's called. Other stuff meant to change. It's meant to adjust. It doesn't always change easily or smoothly, but it kind of has that quality. And I call these the regulatory features. There's about 7 of them. Sleep, stress, and attention. When I say stress, I mean all of the anxiety flavors, essentially. Perseveration, rumination, obsessiveness, all kinds of stuff. Social function, believe it or not, sensory function, sensory integration, picking out sounds and that kind of thing, as well as speed of processing, which is the access to information, how rapidly you learn, how rapidly you have, access to verbal fluency and language stacking like you're describing. And then things like brain fog and sleep quality, you can see those features, and you can't see them in brain mapping, but you can address them reliably. Things that are like brain stability phenomena. These include migraines and seizures, or failures of regulatory stability. So if it's a regulatory phenomena, if it's got shape and change and is meant to be exercised, you can change it. So we get an awful lot of classic neurofeedback clients who have anxiety and ADHD and trauma, and they drink too much. Maybe not the same person, maybe the same person. But it's all the classic stuff that humans deal with. And it can be kids and adults. It doesn't really matter. And then we deal with some neuro stuff because it's brain. People with concussions and migraines and major brain injuries and seizure disorders and other stuff that's really quite extreme. And these days I'm getting an awful lot of neurological post-COVID stuff too. I have decades of data on some of the same people sometimes. And you can sort of see, oh, there's the COVID, and after they
Oh,
got neuro.
wow. So
Oh
you're
yeah,
actually seeing COVID signals.
absolutely. Yeah,
And what does that
almost all
generally
the
show
time.
up as? I think that's curious because I know some people who have spoken about long COVID
Yeah,
and
you see it.
symptomatic brain functioning issues.
Yeah.
And is that related to COVID or is that related to the treatments that were?
No, it's COVID.
It is
It's
the
the
COVID.
same across people. It doesn't matter why or how. It doesn't matter if you're vaccinated or not. All that
Hmm.
matters is, are you symptomatic or not? And you can show the brain signatures without being symptomatic, but you can not vice versa. So if you're feeling the fog and it's from COVID, you'll see it in the brain. Now, the thing is, you don't know what you're looking at. You can't see, oh, that's COVID. It looks just like a concussion. It looks
Oh, an
just
interesting
like
point.
it
So an
looks just
interesting
like
point.
chemotherapy or a mold exposure or a
Right.
Lyme exposure. It looks the same broadly. It's a brain fog signature. You find out it's from COVID by asking. There's some characteristic nature to it for some people. The temporal lobes get more involved. But no, it basically is a non-specific brain fog out of nowhere. And you're like, wow, did you have a concussion? No, I've been feeling really crappy since COVID though. Oh, wow. Okay, yeah, that's what this is then.
So
Super
in that,
obvious.
in what you're saying then, even if someone got COVID, whatever the treatment was they did, whether it was no treatment or treatment, the residual effects of the COVID virus itself leaves a mark in some
Signature. Yeah, I don't think it's every single time.
right.
I think that
It's like
about
the cats.
one.
There's some people that are more
No,
predisposed.
I think it's about 1 out of 3 people who gets COVID
Yeah.
gets a longer term sort of post-COVID. I think we're going to discover there's something that, let's call it post-COVID versus long COVID. Long COVID is that like severe dysautonomia, brain fog, lingering thing. It seems to be a specific, almost like autoimmune phenomena that's cropping up. I think we're going to discover that there's a time course of COVID that is much longer than we have been, talking about. It's not 10 days. It's like 6 months. Because there's lots of literature popping up showing neurological and cardiovascular events surging out of nowhere 6 months, 3 to 6 months after infection. And that's when I see the brain signature, just like a concussion. If you have a mild to moderate concussion, Adelita doesn't duck properly, or something. It's
Right, exactly.
like you do a brain map right away to grab a snapshot, just in case something's really bad, you'll see it. But usually you don't see a concussion when you do an EEG right away. But then it blooms over the next 2 or 3 months as this neuroinflammatory and metabolic load signature starts to emerge. That shows up, I think, about 1 time out of 3 is my take. Because I ask clients as I do intakes about COVID history and things like that. I think it's 1 person out of 3 who gets COVID, who knows they've had it, who then has neurological phenomena. Even if the COVID is super mild, I do believe it's that high. It's 1 person out of 3, essentially. So I think we're going to discover there's this long tail of secondary immune activation, inflammatory phenomena. I think we're going to figure out that that's true. And some people for whom that's just the straw that broke the camel's back, those are the folks that fall over into a dysautonomia, long COVID, profoundly inflammatory, state. But I think we're going to figure out that there's something else under the covers that's sort of like having mono and being sick for 6 months in the background, or having walking pneumonia and being sick for 3 months in the background. I think we're going to figure that out because it looks like, and there was a couple papers out last summer showing autopsies of people that were like documented in care facilities as having not had COVID for 6 months, and you found live virus in deep tissues.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're still learning more about it, but I also think that, doesn't really matter. People end up having lots of wear and tear in their brains. 50% of brain injuries have no symptoms right away, but 8 to 10 years later, there's an inflammatory phenomena or a seizure or some wear and tear. You just don't know, you got to take good care of it. But then thankfully it's an organ that's meant to largely shift and improve. So unless you make big injuries to the brain, you can kind of rebuild it. So it doesn't matter why you have brain fog unless there's something keeping it going. You're sleeping underneath the black mold AC unit, not going to get better doing neurofeedback or anything else. But unless you're continuing to get your concussion collection, big, or you're continuing to get major immune hits again and again, the systems are resilient. They enjoy being brought back to efficient, low stress, healed places generally. So, I wouldn't worry too much about it. COVID's kind of like, it's a thing you can't really avoid getting at this stage, in our modern world. There are people for whom they must be careful because of increased risk, and that means some isolation and or choices around vaccination, which I think has its own immune loading phenomena. But I think that we've reached the point now as a world where it's kind of like it really reminds me a little bit. I might be a few years older, maybe the same age, but I remember in the 80s when HIV was like terrifying because
That's right.
you didn't know. And
Yeah.
you're a teenager, and sex is a thing. You're sexed up. You want everything, but you're terrified at the same time. Terrified of this new thing. The world's going to kill you. And I feel like we reached a point where we had treatments, then it became non-lethal, then we have medications, and then we have destigmatization of safer sex, and that the whole culture shift around that. I sort of think with regards to coronaviruses in general, be it the common cold or COVID itself, we're at the beginning of an accommodation, a safety thing, and I don't know where that's going to lead. I wouldn't have known in the 80s would have retrovirals and giving out condoms to high school kids and things like that. But I think that we're shifting now, and I think keeping yourself safe through whatever wear and tear, whatever injury, whatever things your brain absorbs. You have to have your own level of risk tolerance and exposure, and then deal with the phenomena and build yourself back if you need to. As a phenomena there too.
So I have a theory, and I just want to get you to slice it.
Sure.
Or say, hey, there's some, or refine it, slice it or refine it. In that, would you say that within the self-regulate or the regulatory mechanisms within the body, like excitatory nerves or inhibitory nerves, or all these kind of different processes that keeps your brain functioning properly, that they can be disrupted by immune toxicity, a stressful moment, a traumatic experience, a physical impact, a response to a toxin, a medication, something in the environment or something. All of these could throw, if you will, the direction of your brain like a ship going a little bit off course. It's not noticeable when you leave the port in England that you shift it maybe 1 or 2 degrees, but that determines whether you end up in Greenland or in Miami.
Oh, I would say almost. Yes, all those things have an impact. And yes, all of those things provide sort of steering pressure away from, let's say, regulatory safe harbor, to butcher our metaphors a tiny bit. But the system has gravity. It has an attracting basins. It wants to live in a certain place. It doesn't want to roll up the side of the basin into seizure, into sleeping all day long, into depression. It wants to live in the efficient, safe, useful place. So it takes a while of pushing yourself on one edge of the regulatory modes before it cramps up there or reallocates resources there. Like the back midline, for instance, is the posterior cingulate, the lifeguard. Watch the road, heads up. And we all have one, we all use it. If you learn the world is not safe or predictable, it cramps up super high and you're evaluating for danger all the time. And that might be appropriate. Or you might be stuck in that in a low stress environment. We call that PTSD, that evaluation, that stuck in high gear, visceral place. The brain needs to learn to accommodate, and that's regulatory. But sometimes, the reasons we regulate will bias us towards regulating into the more uncomfortable places. The cost of missing danger, really high. The cost of missing pleasurable things and yummy things, not that high. You'll see more tomorrow. You miss a tiger, you're not going to have more opportunities to avoid tigers, perhaps. So we over-bias towards negative, threatening, dangerous, loss-driven environments, and that tends to create some of this, human suffering experience that we're attached to the thing we're pushing back against a little bit by framing the negative. So I do think there's
news, for example, tends to hyper emphasize the negative because people default to a threat as opposed to, hey, here's some great news or some good news. The response in the system,
negativity bias creeps in, especially if you've learned things were always negative, then that's going to suck. That's going to suck. That's going to, it's the context as well. But then the regulatory modes become their own attractors in the basin, so to speak. So then you end up with your posterior cingulate who's learned that sharks exist. So now you're looking for sharks in the indoor pool. What? No, brain, come on. This fresh water. Yeah, but sharks. Okay, I'm sitting here reading a book. Is it a shark book? Come on, brain. What are you doing? Like it's over biasing. So a lot of the stuff we suffer from, anxiety, stress, sleep, attention, cravings, they're regulatory. And you can reframe them that way, take control of them, massage those circuits, feel them change, and have a different relationship with it. I'm just out of control of my experience, my behavior. So the ship metaphor and the steering is, I think, quite, tight, except that there's this mechanism whose job it is to pull it back towards port constantly. So you got to kind of work at dysregulating unless you're unlucky. Certain types of stressors that are very strongly acute, severe, will dysregulate quite strongly. You can terrify somebody into a seizure or emotionally traumatize somebody in a seizure. It's rare. It doesn't usually happen. Usually you can much more easily dehydrate somebody or give them amphetamines into a seizure much more easily, or certain antidepressants. But there are people for whom, or much more easily you can startle someone into a faint.
Right.
It's the vagovasal reaction, the vagus nerve, right? What happens in the vagus doesn't stay in the vagus, ironically. And it causes huge shifts of physiological change and the body collapses. Or the fainting goats, the goat freezes and falls over as a survival mechanism, a vagovasal response. Yes, the system reacts hyper strong. That's at the edge of that stability. That's when you've crossed out of the basin and you're now in a different mode. You're having a seizure, or you're no longer sleeping, or you're not coming back to ground after stress. You're staying activated. That's when I think you're moving into like dysregulation or even illness level phenomena where you're really having trouble. But those are, still relatively tractable things, just hard to get out of without a push up over that edge of that basin, so to speak.
It's really powerful. Other than, say, improving or regulating or eliminating suboptimal states, how does brain training help us cultivate optimal states or develop unique or new skills that have not been accessible?
Yeah.
So maybe you could walk us through someone coming in for, a situation that was causing a problem for them in life, and they wanted to overcome that. They go in, they go through a series of treatments and everything. They automatically notice it, but then they realize, oh, I got this other little thing that I'm now interested in. I'm kind of good at poetry that I never thought of that before. And then you go, oh, well, would you like to enhance that? What do you mean I can enhance poetry? Well, I didn't even know I had the skill 2 months ago. I was, suffering from my lack of, verbal ideation. And now I am a poet. And maybe I'm thinking about becoming a rapper, when it's like, well, here's the brain thing. So what's that like for you?
Yeah.
And how many people?
A lot of people have those discontinuous experiences. When you're working on your brain, it's everything. So
right.
A lot more than you might expect. Like a lot of folks move from a fixing into a high performance or flow state kind of perspective. I have a more than a handful of very similar sort of success stories where I'm working with some high-powered CEO type who's a little too type A, a little obsessive, kind of anxious, kind of not sleeping great, in their mid-50s, ridiculously successful, but kind of rigid, kind of brittle, kind of an asshole. And we do some work on their sleep, their anxiety, their whatever, and get them some optimization. And then 6 or 8 weeks in, I'm like, wow, we're looking really good with these primary goals of yours. Hey, would you like to do a little more work and blend in some of these other things? And they're like, oh yeah, it sounds good. And I'm telling them things like flow state and access consciousness and ideas and generative creativity and stuff. And then I got a call or an email from their spouse. Whatever you did, do it again. We had the best therapy session. He brought me flowers. He made dinner. What are you doing? What are you doing there at Peak Brain? Like the creativity, the love, the communication. Some of this you mentioned earlier, Dr. Hart, James Hart, the access consciousness stuff is actually really accessible using alpha theta, alpha synchrony, alpha flow state work. And you can reliably educate your ability to do that. If you do that work and you don't have the ability to put your emotions into language, suddenly you do, or you've started to create that ability, that resource. Or I have some folks, I haven't had amazing success, but there's a phenomena called aphantasia, which is when you can't visualize pictures. And something like 1 out of 6 people might have some version of it. It's not a complete version, but it's somewhat common. And you can do alpha theta and other visual tissue driven creativity stuff and actually create visual images while you're having a technologically assisted power nap, essentially. And for folks that haven't had that experience, it gives you a little bit of a softness, a little bit of a creativity, a little bit of a visual experience, and it starts to unlock some stuff. So we often get these effects kind of anyway. I'm not usually saying, hey, do you need to be more in touch with your emotions, CEO? I'm not usually saying that. The person's usually like, okay, great. So we're working on now. I want to work on my motivation and my speed of processing. I'm like, great. Okay, for your speed of processing, I think we might want to try relaxing you deeply first. Oh, that sounds great. All right, try this. And then, wow, I felt really like, I had somebody yesterday try alpha theta, this technique for the first time. And what was the phrase she used? I think she used the phrase, the only way I can describe it is uncomplicated joy. Like she put in a state of uncomplicated joy or something afterwards. And he does, neurofeedback does create state shifts. You feel a little different often after sessions. The real big thing is the trait shift. Look for the changes in resources. I don't love to create states with neurofeedback and to chase states. Some of the short 5-day programs are really about creating an experience, like a shamanic sweat lodge with technology. You have the experience. You might harvest something out of having had the experience, but I prefer to do neurofeedback across weeks and months and create change, like multiple standard deviations of permanent change as a resource, and very slowly and very gradually, so that you have this opportunity to shape it, to build it up, to consolidate it. So, but yeah, I would say that we do get a lot of that peak performer flow state. Some of it's goals, some of it's incidental. I work with a lot of athletes who tend to work with me after injuries, NHL, NFL, UK football players, some divers, some people who get injuries essentially in their sport, and suddenly they're in an out of play protocol, and you can see the concussions. But in all these high level athletes, you also see stress and executive stuff and suboptimal sleep. And you start working on someone's brain, and suddenly their brain fog is gone. And they're like, hey, doc, I feel better than I felt since before my first concussion in high school. It's like 40, post NFL. Or you do some work on someone's brain, and like their seizure disorder, their sleep, and their physical therapist calls you. What are you doing to my client? She walked in without a cane. What are you doing? Oh, really? Oh, that's great. Some elder, who has a spastic arm or something and no balance. Things soften and open up, but you never quite know. And some of this is because you're taking plasticity with every neurofeedback session. You're taking plasticity and boosting it for a while, for like 24 hours, probably at least. And there's good research showing that you get a pretty notable change in just the background plasticity. So you can shape the individual circuits, the microcolumns, but asking for shaping creates a global plasticity change. So the other stuff you're doing lands harder too.
So we're talking about visualization and stuff. One of the traditional reflections of the human brain or state of consciousness in, say, Indian culture is the blooming of a lotus. And for people who want a visual of what happens as an experiential representation, it's like your brain is a partially open flower. And like, if you get enough sunlight into it, and we could use that as the brain frequencies or access to them, there's an unfoldment of the beauty of the flower and the beauty of your own brain. And it's something I've witnessed within myself and my friends that have gone. We've all had this transformative unfolding of what was previously just potential unfolding into a much fuller experience, which is correlated with our life experience. You mentioned something really important about the Peak Brain Institute, and that you do slow and gradual change that people are systematic. And people go, well, I'm not in California, I'm not in this place, but you provide opportunities for people, I believe, that don't have to actually be in there. They could be in a rural area, they could be on the other side of the world. So this is a unique aspect of what you're providing for people, is that they have the ability to train at home using this technology. How did that come about, and why is the Peak Brain Institute focusing on this as one of the value adds that you are performing in your institution?
Yeah, I mean, I guess because I'm so education focused and a bit of a, talking head on this topic of neurofeedback and, functional neuroscience and, tailored individualized neuroscience, people find me, and I started getting client referrals from all over the place and doing remote work even before this company I have now. And the ability to provide access to neurofeedback really does dovetail with my goals for teaching people about their brains. I mean, my goals are to sell you agency, not necessarily neurofeedback. I want you to take some control. I don't care what you do. I mean, sure, pay us money for neurofeedback, but the goal is really to, get you into that perspective. So as I evangelize this idea of, hey, learn about your brain, people are like, but you're not near me. And we used to do hybrid remotes. We'd come to one of our offices for a couple of days and then do everything else remote. And then we went full remote. So we do have 6 offices, 6 presences in the US. Sorry, 6 in worldwide. There's 4 in the US, which include 2 in Southern California, St. Louis, and Manhattan in New York City. And then we've also got London and Stockholm overseas. And those 6 locations see about 20% of our clients, and all the rest, we send out all the equipment. And now we do remote brain mapping. And that's the big thing that few people do remotely, is the actual cap on the head things. And our coaches, we call them coaches, they run your equipment for you and work with you, teaching you stuff and getting you over the technical hurdles. And we run you through learning neurofeedback and sticking wires on your head. And we have this live coaching process where we give you a private channel. It's always open 7 days a week. And you've got all these enthusiastic neuroscience hackers on your private chat ready to jump on and place a wire, troubleshoot some software, come do some research with me to do protocol development for some new goal that you mentioned. And you can then execute on the stuff that we think you might want to try, and report back on how you notice it, and have a good team there to help you develop the more sophisticated or iterative version of same. So we really decoupled from the office phenomena pretty aggressively. And, we offer the fee structure is such for neurofeedback programs that it's lower than therapy rates generally. So we end up being about half as much as the average therapist, but in your home. And if you're in one of the countries we're in, Sweden, the UK, or the US, there's nothing to buy. You just do a service program for a few months. We send you whichever package, whichever gear. You got migraines, we do blood flow training. You've got, anxiety, maybe do some heart rate variability training alongside the EEG. And we build these tailored programs and work with folks for a few months and end up getting the same work done, the same software, the same hardware, the same coaches in our offices as we have virtually. And we encourage people often ask me, hey, is it as good at home? Is it you get better effects in the office? A little secret, we encourage you to train more often when you're at home. We want you to do, if you can, 4 times a week. So in 3 months, you get 55 sessions done. In our offices, we do 3 times a week because that's plenty. But if you have the gear and the brain and the goals, do more. Why not? We don't charge anything extra for it, but it means you can get a lot more done. And so folks that want to structure a bit of time and stay in contact with what's happening and learn some stuff and put up with the slight hassle of doing it can actually take it further than they could if they were working with a therapist, because they're getting deeper into it and doing more essentially. So yeah, our remote program is a lot of what we do. And you can come train in our LA office or, Manhattan if you want to. We're there. but you have to come during open hours, regular business hours. But
Right.
otherwise, you can train from home and ask some coach who's going to be online to help you stick a wire on and check the placement if you need. So
One final question before we sign off. Where do you see neurofeedback, brain feedback, all this whole industry? Where do you see this going in the future, the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years?
Yeah. So I'm really dependent on brain mapping and having a perspective of the model of you that we're working on helping you change. And that's an imperfect, through a glass darkly kind of like 10,000 foot view, confusing information landscape. Part of why it's so hard to understand is because we're looking at sort of artificially static snapshots, one person in the morning without caffeine, and you have to have thousands of people to compare them to have a sort of sense of how that's unusual. But people are a bit more variable than that. And while a brain map, the way it's done now, is stable day to day, you're not getting daily variability because you're being careful about how you're gathering data. So I think that we'll hit a point where we can have sort of longitudinal tracking on, we have sleep trackers and things. And if we also had the speed of your alpha, and if you're using cannabis and when you took your Adderall, indexed in time against brain measurements, now we're starting to get more of a wild type, if you will, database of brain variability and less of an illness versus the middle of the bell curve data type, which is sort of how it's conceptualized now. That's step one, is the better sort of like biohacker's perspective on how to collate all the data. I'm working on that. I have some software I'm working on to help us have fitness tracker for the brain kind of stuff this year, I promise, guys. But that's the first step. The next step, I think, is we're going to be able to have essentially intelligent avatars. Data sets that we can experiment on. Oh, let me give my brain data set some Adderall and see how it reacts. Ooh, my brain doesn't like Adderall, apparently. Not taking it, just testing the model of executive function, because I think we've reached the ability between the generative models and the machine learning models and the LLM models and the actual data we understand with the brain. I think we've reached the point now where you can throw up a model of a brain, your brain, and test drugs, test interventions, test sleep hacks, test biohacks, test versions of magnesium. By the way, thank you. I have to say, we'll talk more about this at some point, but I got this lovely package from Bioptimizers with some magnesium and digestive enzymes in it. I'm very excited to take those. But I think we're going to the place where you're going to be able to do the tailored biohacking thing, but in a prospective way. You can test your genes. Like even now, you can do a methylation status and go, oh yeah, methylcobalamin, hydroxycobalamin. Oh, that's a better version for me, probably. And you're probably right. Not always methylation, but it's getting closer. I think that stuff is where the brain is going to be, the brain frontier will be broken through. Right now, even just fitting the drug you might need for your depression, the psychiatrist doesn't necessarily know how to pick the right drug. Mm-hmm. And you can use a QEEG to predict drug response in depression. If you take an antidepressant, 10 days after you take it, your brain shows the change it's going to feel a month later.
Amazing.
So I think that's where we're going, is this like more testing the intervention landscape, using that really rich data set to start to model our transformation in advance of actually doing it. Test beds, essentially.
Very exciting. Where do people find out more about you, your organization, how they can get started on brain training? I can't encourage people enough to go do that. So if you could give us all the handles, the connections, where they can find out more. And I can say wholeheartedly, if you on the fence about brain training, you think it might be for you, just go do it. Just go do it. It will change your life.
Thanks for that. You can check us out at peakbraininstitute.com is the main website. I think all the socials are still at Peak Brain LA, which you can check us out on all the major social places. And we also have some overseas sites, but you can get to any of our countries from our main website. So, come hit us up, chat. All the senior coaches hang out on the chat box. It's not some random bot or call center. It's actually all the coaches, because we're online 7 days a week helping you train your brain. So come chat with us about your brain.
It's amazing. Dr. Andrew Hill, you're doing a great contribution to society and to the future of many generations to come. And compiling all that data and providing that service is something that's truly incredible. Thank you for that.
Of course.
Thank you to our listeners. This is Wade T. Lightheart. This is the Awesome Health Podcast from Bioptimizers. Go do some brain training. Believe me, you'll be glad you did. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next episode.
At Bioptimizers, our mission is to fix digestion. And a cornerstone of digestion is gut flora. P3OM is our patented probiotic formula. In fact, we call it the Navy SEALs of probiotics. You see, strong proteolytic or protein digesting activity is paramount to having a healthy gut flora. And of course, P3OM provides that. The good news is, unlike weaker probiotics, P3OM survives the digestion process. What it does is it basically multiplies the good guys while protecting you against pathogens, or what some people call the bad guys. P3OM really helps to rebuild your digestion. And what that allows you to do is to maximize nutrient uptake, energy, and metabolism. To find out more of how P3OM can help you, go to www.bioptimizers.com.
Thank you for listening to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. You can find more information at bioptimizers.com.